outside the 9 years day.
Okay, so last week we basically looked at the rescue of the people of God from slavery and God bringing them to worship him. So the premise of the book of Exodus is who is God that we would want to obey and worship him. And so God has shown his power and his authority and his justice by judging Egypt, and his mercy by bringing his people, his chosen people, out of slavery, and has brought them to Mount Sinai to worship him or to get to know him. And so he is showing himself, showing who he is, and he is wanting to relate with this people he is rescued. And so the important thing before we get to the 10 Commandments is the fact that God has already shown that he loves his people. He has already rescued them. So the 10 Commandments are not a way to gain God's favor. Rather, they are a response to what he has already done. And so what God speaks is a way to show that you belong to him, a way to recognize that you are in relationship with him. We don't want to be confused that the law is somehow a way to earn God's favor. The law is an outworking of the relationship that the people already have with a God who has loved them and shown them favor and rescued them and saved them. So we really need to make sure that that is where we're coming from, because people look at the Old Testament and they say, oh, it's just a list of rules. And all God wants is for you to follow the rules. But as we can see from the beginning, God's purpose isn't that we follow rules, it's that we have a relationship with him.
They sort of say the old covenant is about keeping laws and the new covenant is grace. It's actually grace all the way.
Yes. Yeah. Without God's grace, there would have been no rescue. And so this rescue that God did in Exodus is actually a foreshadowing of a greater rescue that's going to happen. And so the living out of these words is also a foreshadowing of how God's people are going to be able to live in perfect communion with him, glorifying him and showing what his character is like in their lives. So that is, I think, where we need to be thinking about the 10 Commandments. So they are sitting at Mount Sinai, and God has said through Moses that he is actually wanting to meet with the people. And it's quite significant that he wants them to consecrate themselves. And there's this repetition, 1, 2, 3, 4 times, that on the third day he's going to reveal himself. And if we track through the Old Testament, lots of very significant things happen on the third day. Just in preparation for one super significant event that will be happening on the third day in the future.
Can you think of one really obvious one, like other than the resurrection? So yeah, an Old Testament one. Old Testament. Yeah.
It's easy to read through and not realise that this happened on the third day and that happened on the third day.
That's why they think you will know, and that's Jonah. 3 days in the well, and then that's actually referred to in the New Testament as well. So as an it's been 3 days. Yeah.
A few weeks ago, when we talked about Abraham sacrificing his son, God actually says to him on the third day, go up to the mountain. Just little hints all the way through the Bible. that foreshadow future events. And in chapter 19, the people are coming out, and God is going to reveal himself to the whole congregation. And how does he do that? Chapter 19, verse 18. Now Mount Sinai was wrapped in smoke because the Lord had descended on it in fire. The smoke of it went up like the smoke of a kiln, and the whole mountain trembled greatly. And the sound of the trumpet grew louder and louder. Moses spoke, and God answered him in thunder. The Lord came down on Mount Sinai to the top of the mountain, and the Lord called Moses to the top of the mountain, and Moses went up. And then there's a few sections here where Moses goes going up and down the mountain. But the most important thing is that God speaks. And when God speaks, chapter 20, verse 1 says, God spoke all these words. And then we get the 10 life-giving words is how the Bible puts it. The 10 words, which we then call the 10 Commandments. And there is a parallel. Remember back in Genesis chapter 1, I said, and God said, was 10 times. God said, and God said, and God said, when God was creating life and the world. And so when he speaks the 10 Commandments, it's almost like he is breathing new creation into his people. And so they are a new creation that are going to bring life by the way they reflect who God is in their lives and actions. So I don't think we need to go through all the commandments. Significantly, God starts with the importance of worshipping him alone, and everything after that flows from having God as center. And so God encourages Israel to have no other gods before him, to not make images, to not take his name in vain, and to remember the Sabbath day. And so all of those first commandments are about focusing on who God is and having him as the center. And what will flow out of that is you're going to love your neighbor. And the following commandments are about honoring father and mother, not murdering, not committing adultery, not stealing, not bearing false witness, and not coveting, are all reflections on if you love God and you're going to love others, then you are going to want to love them and not be selfish in the way that you behave. So you're not going to want to take people's lives, things, possessions, wives. Yeah. So,
and probably you can see the way Jesus actually summarizes it when he's asked what's the greatest commandment. Do you remember what he answered? Love the Lord your God with all your heart and love your neighbor as yourselves. And so he basically summarizes those two, first 4 and then the second 6 in when he was summarizing.
And so I think one other good thing to remember is that what God is doing is he's giving them good things by speaking his words. And remember that he's actually saying this out loud. Everyone gathered around the mountain is able to hear his voice. And it was terrifying. They were so terrified, if we look at chapter 20, verse 18, when all the people saw the thunder and flashes of lightning and the sound of the trumpet and the mountain smoking, the people were afraid and trembled, and they stood far off and said to Moses, you speak to us and we'll listen, but do not let God speak to us lest we die. And Moses says, do not fear, for God has come to test you, that the fear of him may be before you, that you may not sin. And so what happens is the people actually experience God in their midst, and they recognize that they cannot cope with that because they're sinful and foreign to the holiness and power of God, and they recognize they need someone to mediate between God and them. And so even before they have the golden calf incident, they are recognizing that even though God wants to dwell with them and for them to be in his presence, they are recognizing that they can't. Like, he is holy, they are sinful, he is so powerful, and they are afraid. And so they need some way for it to work. And so what God does is he sets forth the idea of a place in the middle where he will be present, but the access to him will be limited. So he will be within their presence, but access will be limited and mediated by blood of animals, so that the priests can go in, they can commune with God in a limited way, and then the people are able to experience the presence of God, but not die. Because I think that the big thing is, and that's what's going to be expressed in Numbers, is the tension between people living in God's presence and the danger of being in God's presence, because he is holy and powerful and we are sinful.
Oh, there you go.
Hello. Yeah. And so because they can't actually sustain living in God's presence, he makes a way for it to be possible for them to be in his, or to experience his presence in an accessible way, and it's limited, even though he's inviting them back to the experience of Eden. There isn't a way for them to experience that in all its fullness. But this anticipates that that's going to happen eventually. So those 10 life-giving words are a way that the people can respond to God's presence in their midst. And so what we get in Exodus after the 10 Commandments are a few chapters where there's a bit of an expansion of what it means, or how you can apply those commandments in everyday life, and specifically about social justice and worshipping. And then further on, we will see in Deuteronomy that those 10 commandments get expanded out again. And so you get kind of examples of cases where you can apply how to follow these commandments in everyday life. Yeah, anything you want to say about that? They make these promises to God right at the beginning, in chapter 24. So just after God speaks, and they're all afraid, Moses alone goes up and the people stay on the mountain. And so we get this picture of there being a very holy place where God is, and Moses is allowed to come in and talk to him. And then there's an area where the priests are allowed to go, and then there's this place where all the people are at the bottom of the mountain. So it's like these steps up, which is then mirrored in the tabernacle, where there's a holy place the most holy place, then the holy place, and then a place where people can go. But we see, and I think this is a very significant part in Exodus, in chapter 24, verse 9, chapter 24, verse 7. No, 6, sorry. They offer burnt offerings, and then Moses takes half of the blood and throws it against the altar, and then he also takes blood and sprinkles it on all people. And so it's like he is cleansing them and making it appropriate for them to approach God. And it's also symbolic of this idea of covenant, which, remember, we saw with Abraham, that God fulfilled both sides of it when he walked through the dead animals. The sacrifices are like the dead animals, and the blood is to remind them of what God and they are doing when they say these words in verse 3. All the words that the Lord has spoken, we will do. And they repeat it again in verse 7. All that the Lord has spoken, we will do, and we will be obedient. So God says, you're going to be my people, or you already are my people. And they say, our response to this is that we're going to listen and obey God. And then the people stay at the bottom, but Moses and Aaron and his sons and some elders go up a little bit further. And verse 10, something amazing that hasn't happened since Eden. They saw the God of Israel. There was under his feet, as it were, a pavement of sapphire stone, like the very heaven for clearness. And he did not lay his hand on the chief men of the people of Israel, so they didn't die. And they beheld God and ate and drank. So what are they doing there? They're actually fellowshipping in God's presence. They see God sitting on his throne, and they participate in fellowship with him, eating and drinking. And that is an anticipation of heaven, what we're going and we see pictures of this again in Revelation. And so then Moses is invited up to the mountain, and he spends 40 days receiving instruction about how the tabernacle is to be constructed. And so the tabernacle is super significant because it is the place where the people are going to be able to meet with God, and the way that they're going to be able to be mediated for, so that they can participate in the presence of God to some measure. And so we get from chapter 25 through to chapter 28 descriptions of exactly how the tabernacle is to be made. And when we read through these descriptions, we can see images of stories that we've already heard in Genesis. There's images, we get images of the ark because there's acacia wood, and we also get lots of images of the Garden of Eden. And the most holy place is full of beautiful things, gold, silver, bronze, blue and purple and scarlet yarns, and the curtains in the middle of this tabernacle are to have pictures of beautiful flowers and trees, and also there's angels guarding the entryway, which remind us of the angel with the flaming sword that stands in between Adam and Eve and going back into the Garden of Eden. And so this just is a continual reminder that God is inviting them back to this relationship that he had with them, with humans in Genesis, in the Garden of Eden. And so Israel, when they get to the land of Canaan, which is their promised land, which is also likened to Eden, they have this relationship with God in the center of their life, and in the center of their nation. That is a reminder of Eden. But even before Moses gets down with these instructions, in chapter 32, there is a breaking of the covenant. So within 40 days of them saying, yes, we will obey, yes, we have heard God speaking, and we want to do what he says, they already don't. And we get a repetition almost of Adam and Eve's sin. And a repetition of the need for God to punish sin, and the consequences of sin. And we find that Moses stands forward to mediate. So the people reject God. They build this calf, they worship it, and Moses stands up to intercede. And it's interesting to look at how Moses reflects God's anger to the people, but also God stands between. Moses stands between God and the people, asking for mercy and forgiveness. So he reflects God to the people, but he also pleads to God for the people. And Abraham, remember, when he was pleading for Sodom and Gomorrah, he was actually asking for God not to destroy the people who were righteous, along with the wicked. But here, Moses is saying, please don't destroy these wicked people. So he's actually pleading for sinful people in this. So he kind of takes it a step further than Abraham did. And I guess this intermediary position, he foreshadows what Jesus is going to do. Because as mediator, he actually says, please don't kill these people. They deserve to die, but don't do it. And he even goes as far as saying, take me.
Yeah, that be wrong for one thing.
In chapter 32, verse 32, verse 30, Moses says to the people, you've sinned a great sin, and now I will go up to the Lord. Perhaps I can make atonement for your sin. And then he goes up to the Lord and says to God, if you will forgive their sin, please forgive them. But if not, blot me out of your book. So he actually has this idea that maybe someone could take their place and receive the punishment that they deserve. But God says you can't do that because you're just as sinful as they are. And so, but he says, I will not destroy them because you have interceded. But then he says, I'm not going to go with you. And Moses basically says to God, well, if you don't go with us, what's the point of us going to the promised land? If you're not going to be there, what is the point? And so he actually goes back and pleads to God that he would show them favor and consider them and not reject them as he has said he would. And he also asks that God would show him who he is. And we get this amazing situation in chapter 33, where Moses says in verse 18, please show me your glory. And God says, I will make all my goodness pass before you, and I will proclaim before you my name. And then we see that happen in chapter 34. And I think the interesting thing is that Moses is allowed to see God, but the way God reveals himself to Moses is by what he says. And so even though he can't see God face to face, God says, yeah, I'll let you see my back. But the way God reveals himself is through his word. And what does he say? Can someone read chapter 34, verses 5 through to the end of 7?
Then the Lord came down in the cloud and stood there with him and proclaimed his name, the Lord. And he passed in front of Moses, proclaiming, the Lord, compassionate, gracious God, slow to anger, abounding in love and faithfulness, maintaining love to thousands and forgiving wickedness, rebellion, and sin. Yet he does not leave the guilty unpunished. He punishes the children and their children for sin of their parents to the third and the fourth generation.
Okay. So right here, similarly to when God approaches Moses in the burning bush, he declares who he is. And when it says the Lord here, it's Yahweh, it's the name of God. And so he passes before him and he says, I am who I am, repeated. And then he explains his character: merciful, gracious, slow to anger, abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness. And in the book here, there's a little section on God's covenant love, which is called Hesed. And this Hesed, or God's covenant love, is really, really important. It's about how much he loves his people because he's in relationship with them and he is faithful to all his promises. And he is going to keep working in and with his people because he is love. He is faithful and he will love on the basis of his character and that his promises that he's already made. And so when we see steadfast love and faithfulness, that's this idea of God's covenant keeping Hesed. He loves because he is faithful to his promises. He shows his love through being faithful to his promises. And this steadfast love is given abundantly. And in verse 7, we see the extent of his love because he keeps steadfast love for thousands. That can be translated as thousands of generations. So his love is so great that it's worth thousands of generations. But he is a just God and he needs to punish sin. But when we see how much he punishes sin, he visits iniquity to the third and fourth generation. So I think my understanding of this passage isn't that you are punished for your parents' sin. Rather, or you are blessed because of the previous generation who loves God. Rather, it's actually giving us a difference between God's infinite love and his perfect justice. But his mercy is far outweighs his judgment. So there is just judgment for sinners, but his perfect, loving, faithful righteousness way exceeds by 1,000-fold his judgment. So I don't think that we are to think of this in a literal sense that you are punished because your parent was sinning. I don't think that's how we should be looking at this.
Because that would be unjust.
That wouldn't be just,
Yeah.
that's right. So I think it's showing us a comparison between how God justly punishes sin, but his mercy and faithfulness far outweigh. It's given to thousands of generations to those who love him. So there's this comparison between thousands of generations and 3 generations of those who hate him. So for those who oppose God, there is just judgment, but his mercy far outweighs that, and he offers his forgiveness and grace to all of those who seek his mercy and grace.
Can I just add one
Yes,
thing?
please.
It's only relatively, it just fits in with exactly what you said, but just the idea, if you have a look yourselves at the name. So in both those verses, Julie pointed out, please show me your glory. I will make my goodness pass before you and will proclaim before you my name. And then down in the other one, the Lord descended in the cloud, proclaimed the name of the Lord. That, we've already talked about it. His character, the name of the Lord is not just a word, it encapsulates the whole character of God. And just to think about what that means in the commandment too, do not take the name of the Lord in vain. I know when I was, I was like almost, what's the word? Like I was both paranoid about taking the name of the Lord as a child like that. And then obviously we shouldn't, but it's actually more than that. It's more than the word. It's about that the name encapsulates the character of God. And that's what we need to be, honouring and not taking lightly or misusing.
Yeah, and I think that one of the things that has kind of come out of this
superstitious was what I was.
Yeah,
I was almost superstitious about.
Yeah, and some of that is, and it seems to have come out in the Judaic tradition, is that you actually don't speak or even write the name of God. But God doesn't say that here, that you can't speak my name. He actually says in his word, you need to swear on my name. So basically God's name is to be used by his people because that's how we declare our allegiance with who he is. And so when, and we are going to see all the way through the Bible, and it's amazing how often it comes up, this passage, these characteristics of God, that he is merciful, gracious, slow to anger, abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness. That is repeated over and over. We see it in the Psalms, we see it in the prophets, and we see it in all the history of God. Whenever the leaders or the prophets appeal to God's nature and appeal for mercy, they always do it based on his character and always appeal to his merciful, gracious forgiveness. So if you ever want to learn one of the most key verses in the Old Testament, this is it. Who is God? Learn chapter 34, verses 6 and 7. Because everything, this encapsulates who God is. It encapsulates who God is, and it's reflected in the rest of the Bible. Yeah. And so God says, okay, I'm going to go with you. And what you need to do is to build the tabernacle so that you as a people can worship me. And so then and it's almost like God allows for demonstrates his forgiveness in that now they can construct the tabernacle and actually have his presence dwell among them. He has said before, no, I'm not going to go with you, but now he was saying, build the tabernacle and I will be with you. And so at the end of Exodus, we have.
Can I just point out one thing?
Yes,
just
please.
back in 33:7, where it says pitch the tent outside the camp. And that was that period where he's actually saying it has to be outside. It's no longer centered like where originally it's centered with the tribes of Israel around it. It's now outside because there's that separation.
Yeah, and I think that this was even before they built the tabernacle. So it was the place where Moses went to meet with God, and he couldn't do it inside the camp because God had said, I'm not going to be with you. And then he mediates, intercedes, and then God says, okay, build the tabernacle and I will come and dwell with you. And so just as previously we get a kind of very detailed instructions for building the tabernacle, then we get a number of chapters. How many chapters? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 chapters, or 5 or 6 chapters of the express building of the tabernacle in accordance with the instructions that they've been given. And what happens right at the end is just God's mercy in that. Can someone read chapter 40, verse 34 and 35? Chapter 40, verse 34 and 35.
Then the cloud covered the tent of meeting, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. Moses could not enter the tent of meeting, because the cloud had settled it, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle.
Okay, so we now have the situation where what was happening on the top of Mount Sinai is now come right into the middle of the people. So before they were separated by the mountain, now he's actually come right into their presence and into their camp. But this is still outside. No, this is now right.
Because right after that he renews the covenant.
Yeah.
So just after that, showing the separation at the end of that same chapter, he then renews his covenant with them. I think verse 15.
Yeah, and so we get again this repetition that they said before. Where is it? That they say, oh yeah, there we are, 34. Verse 10, God renews the covenant. I'm making a covenant before you, and all people among you shall see the work of the Lord. And there's almost a bit of a repetition of the 10 commandments. And I was sure that there was somewhere where they say again, we will, everything that you say we will do, like there's a repetition.
They do in Deuteronomy.
Yes, they do. They do it multiple times. I thought I had it written down somewhere. There is a repetition of the fact that they all again say that they will do everything that God has commanded. And at the end of chapter 40, we also get repetition. Moses did according to all the Lord has commanded. And in verse 16, Moses did according to the Lord. 19, as the Lord commanded. 21 as the Lord commanded, 23 as the Lord commanded, 25 as the Lord commanded, 27 as the Lord commanded, 29 as the Lord commanded, 32 as the Lord commanded, and so Moses finished the work, and that is reflective of God in at the end of his creation, resting. And in Genesis chapter 1, at the end of chapter 1, beginning of chapter 2, God says, and God rested. Or no, chapter 2, verse 2 of Genesis, on the seventh day, God finished his work that he had done. And in chapter 40, verse 33, Moses finished the work. And so it's like this is the beginning of a new creation. The work of creating the tabernacle, which is like a replica of Eden, is finished. And there's this possibility of being in relationship with God. But can anyone see a problem in verse 35? God is there in the middle of their midst. What's the problem? They can't go in. And so what needs to happen? There needs to be a way for sinful people to be able to go into the presence of God. And what is that way? It's through the sacrificial system, which we then get expounded for us in Leviticus. Now, we said we'd finish at 3, so I don't know whether we're going to get through all of Leviticus.
Let's go through all of Leviticus and talk.
Yeah.
I reckon we can do it.
Yeah, so basically what Leviticus and the importance of Leviticus, and especially in this point in the Torah, because it's right at the center, it's in this crucial moment where God has come in the midst of his people, but they actually can't have a relationship with him. So Leviticus explains to us that the only way they can access God is through the sacrificial system, which there is requirement of blood to cleanse and pave the way for them to enter into that holy place. What we see in Leviticus is similar to what we saw on the mountain. So God was at the top of the mountain and Moses was able to go up there. Then the priests were able to go up a little way and they actually saw God and had some fellowship with him. And then the people were down the bottom waiting for the priests to mediate for them in that process. So now we get those concentric circles, but starting from the most holy place in the tabernacle. So at the moment, no one can even go in there. But by the end of Leviticus, the priests are able to go in there. The high priest is able to go right into the very presence of God in the most holy place once a year. But then there's this most holy place, then there's a holy place, and then there's the tabernacle where people, the priests can go. The people are allowed within the framework of the tabernacle grounds. So there's like a fence around, and then there's the tabernacle right in the middle. So they're allowed in the fence to go and do their sacrifices. And then there's the camp, which contains God's holy people. And then outside the camp, a little bit further away, the mixed multitude that have come with them out of Egypt and who maybe join them along the way. And then after that is the desert. And it's like the realm of the dead, those who aren't part of God's presence. So we get this holy to kind of unclean variation. And so what the idea is of Leviticus is to make the unclean become clean and holy so that it can come into God's presence. And so that's the premise of Leviticus, is to help us understand that there is this separation, there's these degrees of separation, and how that can be overcome so that people can get to the most holy place.
That sounds like a good overview to dive into. Just by way of it, the sort of the biblical framework of the Bible, what's really interesting, I didn't look this up, I was just thinking about it then. When they're finally getting to the promised land and they build the temple, and then they're so sinful, which you read we don't cover it in this course, but judges and kings, they're super sinful. And eventually you have 3 lots of people exiled, and by the final exile the temple is destroyed. But right before the temple's destroyed, Ezekiel, who's already, is it Ezekiel or is it yeah, it is Ezekiel, I think, who's already in exile, sees the cloud leaving the temple. So he sees the presence of God actually leaving the temple right before Jerusalem is completely overrun by Nebuchadnezzar.
And one of the things that happens in all of that time, that instead of keeping the holy place of God holy, idols creep in. And by the time the presence of God actually leaves or is visualized by Ezekiel, the whole temple is full of idols.
Yeah,
they're not actually worshipping God there. There's idols in the Holy of Holies. So they've actually replaced God and desecrated his temple.
And so he leaves.
Yeah,
it's
so he leaves.
frightening. It's quite frightening. But when you see it's a reversal of these images of God coming down, it's like, no, I'm down.
Yeah.
Leaving. But of course, he always remains faithful to his promise.
Yeah.
And he maintains a remnant, but just not there. He then that visions in exile. Yeah.
And then when they rebuild the temple, there isn't so when Solomon builds the first temple, we get a similar experience where the Spirit of God enters and fills it. But when they rebuild the temple after the exile, it doesn't do that. And it's almost like this big letdown. Where's God? And it's not until 400 years later, when Mary and Joseph bring Jesus into the temple, that God actually enters that temple. So
I love the way the imagery, even though these books go such a massive amount of time, that the imagery and is consistent all the way through. I think one that I listened to this morning was the eagle. Talks about the God looking after the desert as like being on eagle's wings, and then that's repeated, that God's care and deliverance is often used. The eagle is often used as for that.
So we get this repetition of the imagery of Eden, and that's the tabernacle, which later becomes the temple. But then Jesus changes it and talks about the temple being himself, and that it's broken or destroyed and is raised in 3 days. And then we get those images of the temple. Well, in Revelation, there isn't a temple because God dwells within his people. And there isn't a need for this system because Jesus has accomplished that. So that's why in Revelation there isn't a temple in the New Jerusalem. And in fact, the way the New Jerusalem is described in Revelation is a description of the most holy place, the Holy of Holies. So if you want to compare, look at the descriptions of the Holy of Holies in Exodus, and then have a look at how the New Jerusalem is described in Revelation, and you'll see that it's described as a cube, gold and precious stones, and that is symbolic of all of the new heavens and earth are the holy place because, or the very most holy place, because that's where we all have access.
And also the idea of rest, it's the same. Like Eden is the place that we have had rest. And then, you know, like you say, Jesus is then the temple. Where they're seeking rest, Jesus is the temple, and in him we find rest. And then in Revelation, there's no temple because that's where we have complete rest. Yeah.
So these images that are established here are carried throughout the Bible, and we can see how they're fulfilled in Jesus, and they will point to Jesus. Sometimes it's a veiled picture. Sometimes it's quite pointed.
Also, he points to them too,
Yes.
doesn't he? Like, because talking to his Jewish readers, he would have known. So when he says these things, he knows that it will trigger these recollections of their history. Yes.
So, does anyone have any questions that they had through the reading of the rest of Exodus?
Just from today, that sort of, like the priests saw God and ate and drank, and then later on it's like, no man can see me and you. And then he does show himself to Moses. And it's like, well, why is Moses asking him? He's already been up there.
Yeah, I guess the more that you experience God in his glory, the more you want to experience that. Yeah, absolutely. And so, you know, he said, I've seen your throne, or, you know, basically this description that we get of where the priests actually eat. It's not necessarily that they see God, they see basically a similar vision to when we see later on descriptions of the throne of God, but not actually God himself.
Okay.
And so it's like they experience the presence of God, but they don't actually, like, yes, they participate in his glory and it's like they do see it, but Moses wants more. Like, he's like, yeah, I've experienced this, I want more. Which is, I think, something that we as Christians ought to be desiring, just like Moses. And I think that Paul encourages that. He says, you know, it's like, because there's this description of Moses putting the veil over his face, and it's like we have veiled faces now, but then we're going to be able to participate in God's glory, and we will have faces that shine like Moses did when he was in God's presence. So there's this movement that our desires are to participate more and more in the glory of God. And I think Moses gives us an example of that, wanting that and desiring that. And God shows that it's a right desire, it's a good desire. And he grants that to Moses. But his promise to us is even more than what Moses experienced. And so through Jesus, we have full access to God in a way that even Moses never did. And that should blow our minds, because look at the process that Moses had to go through to get the experience that he got. And Jesus has opened the way for us to get an even more full experience of God's presence than Moses even ever dreamed that he would have. That should blow our minds. Yeah. Any other questions or thoughts? So, well, we'll go for Leviticus and see whether we can get through some of Numbers as well next week.
She's ever.
Yeah, I'm always hopeful.
But,
Yeah, we really accomplished what
I've been getting through Leviticus one session's pretty good.
Well,
Yeah, we could.
the thing is that what is in the book in chapter 7 here isn't actually that much more in depth than what I've already just described as an introduction. So I actually don't know that there's much more apart from I want us to look at the Day of Atonement in depth. Yeah. But you know what's in here isn't that much more.
There's a lot more there.
There is a
But
lot
yeah,
more,
but
but what's required in this course isn't a lot more than what he said.
Thanks, Trace.
Mm.